Went by really fast today. I did not even notice that it was already 1:30. Like, I had no idea. I'm glad I decided to take a break now because this is when we have to do our discussion segment. So for the moment, we're gonna stop playing Osu for a little bit, and we are going to have a talk. And what today's talk is going to be about is going to be memorization. And I wanted to start off this discussion by throwing out the concept of memorization as sort of a fundamental skill. And I'm gonna go through and define fundamental skill just because I think it's very important and relevant to this discussion. And it's also something that is almost purely my opinion. It's not something that I've talked about with a lot of other people, and I haven't really gotten input on whether or not people agree what fundamental skills are. So we're just going to define it for the sake of the discussion. And fundamental skills are skills that apply purely to physical muscle memory. And they are not related to patterns, because I consider patterns to be a technical ability in the game where if you improve at patterns, you won't necessarily improve in other aspects of gameplay. So we're defining a fundamental skill as essentially everything except for patterns. So that would be aim, that would be speed, that would be accuracy, that would be your ability to read, that would be endurance, that would be stamina. Those are fundamental skills, and you'll notice that those things that I listed are all things that are completely, if you want to improve on them, you have to do it via muscle memory. You cannot do it via some sort of mental understanding or trick. It's all down to the way that it feels in your muscles. And I think it's not a very well fleshed out definition of a fundamental skill, but it's something that I think, for the purposes of this discussion, is adequate. We don't need to really go any further with defining it unless we wanted to be super technical, which we really don't. But I kind of want to address the idea of memorization being a fundamental skill in the game of Osu. And I do think that memorization is a fundamental skill, and I'll explain why in just a second. I kind of want to turn this up a little bit. Ew, I don't like this music. Let's do something else. Let's do some Nujabes. And let's turn it down just a little bit more. Okay, so I lost my place. Oh yeah, so we're gonna talk about why I think memorization is a fundamental skill, and why it's something that is highly underrated. So the reason that I say that is because whenever you go and you discuss improving with anybody, first off, I don't think a lot of people in the community necessarily give a lot of good advice for improvement, because the game, from a certain standpoint, of certain viewpoint, is purely down to muscle memory. So it's almost all, in that sense, fundamental skills, and there's really no complex mechanics that you can discuss and be like, hey, like, let's say if you're in League, and you're playing League of Legends, some complex mechanics might be interactions between characters' abilities, or maybe certain matchups that go into different lanes. Like one example that I've used in the past was Akali versus Karthus. Pre-level 6, that's a really hard lane for Akali, and then level 6, it's a super easy lane for Akali. So that's an example of stuff that is kind of less fundamental and more technical, in the sense that it's in the way the game's mechanics work. Whereas Osu there's almost no extra mechanics in the game. It's just purely you click circles. If you want to use that kind of joke. But it really is a very fundamental game, so people, when they usually give advice, it's usually just stuff like play more, which I think is really poor advice because it doesn't have any content. Of course these people are playing more, of course they want to play more, Um, and the idea behind giving that kind of advice is, well, if you play more, eventually you'll improve. And it's just a matter of not noticing your improvement. But I think that's poor advice on a lot of levels, and the biggest one is because it completely throws away the mental aspect of Osu. Because I actually think because Osu is such a fundamental game, from a physical perspective, it's almost purely mental in other aspects, and which is why I think memorization is an important skill that needs to be discussed as something that should be considered more important towards your gameplay. Because when people talk about improving beyond saying just play more, a lot of the discussion is, well, you have like aim, you should work on your aim, you should work on your streams, you should work on reading different stuff. Nobody ever says you should work on memorizing maps, and I think that's highly underrated. Memorizing maps, at least. And I found this out when I was playing some flashlight maps, and I was doing flashlight just for fun, you know. I just wanted to see what the mod was, and actually really ended up enjoying flashlight, but that's kind of beside the point. I ended up realizing that if you can memorize particular parts of a map, you can kind of cheat your body's muscle memory. And I think one of the reasons why people don't consider memorization as a fundamental skill is the idea that if you're sight reading a map, the only problems you're ever going to have are your other fundamental skills. You're not ever going to have problems with it's always going to be an issue of, well, you're just not aiming well enough, or, well, you have bad timing, or you have bad endurance, you don't have enough mental fortitude to finish the map. And that's probably why memorization as an aspect of fundamental gameplay is thrown to the curb, is because people feel very much like if you can't do a map, it's because you're lacking in some other fundamental skill. And again, I consider memorization a fundamental skill. I would define it as that because it is something that, to an extent, is down to muscle memory. If you're going to memorize a map, you're putting muscle memory into your body. It is like the very definition of a fundamental skill, almost, in that sense. And so, I actually think there's a lot of discussion to be had, and the concept of utilizing memorization to make some really crazy plays. And then once you get into that discussion, it becomes a matter of, well, is it worth memorizing? Because it can take a long time to memorize certain parts of maps to make huge plays. But it's also something that when you look at some professional, I don't want to say professional, because they're not technically professional players. But if you look at people like Cookiesy, he'll edit his maps, so he only has to play one specific part of the map so he can memorize it, you know? Things like that, and I think that's very underrated for the regular player base, the people who aren't necessarily players like Cookiesy, or in the top, like, 500 or whatever. And I think it's something that people should focus on more, because it's an aspect of your gameplay that almost cheats the other fundamental aspects of the game. Like, if you have really good memory on a map and you know the ins and outs of the map, then you don't necessarily have to have good aim to be able to do the map. Even if the map is like a higher level in terms of aim than what you can do, that's okay if you can memorize the map. And some could argue then you could do the map, but it's an issue of almost endurance then it becomes, because you have to memorize individual parts of the map if you're doing something like that. And I feel like the issues would arise when with your aim and stringing together all those parts into one consecutive play. And there's a certain skill where maybe you can't do that, but you can do like each individual difficult part of the map on its own. And the concept is, if you memorize those specific parts, then you put them together once you have all of the memorization down, and it kind of like almost cheats the other skills that you have, because you're not necessarily like having fantastic endurance or aim overall. It's just in that specific part you're doing well in those categories. I'm gonna read chat a little bit. Hey, Ultra Sonya. How's it going, man? Welcome back. Yeah, I'll look them up, for our next play. Flashlight, Dan's game, RIP. In that case, memorization only helps you on that one specific map, right? Yes, it does. But I also think memorization is a skill that can be developed, and then you can apply that skill to other maps. Like the specific instance of memorizing will only apply to that one map. But if you develop it as a skill, because I think it is something that you can practice, and you can go into it like, I feel like I have pretty good memorization skills when it comes to playing, and a lot of the times what I'll do when I stream is I'll have like certain periods where I'll mess up, and then I'll be like, okay, I can recall almost nearly exactly the mistakes that I made and what ended up happening, and I feel like I can do that because it's an issue of memorization. And in that sense, it then becomes a very valuable skill because it can help you be analytical and critical of yourself, and it can help you analyze your previous plays. So in that sense, maybe it's something that could be useful that doesn't necessarily apply specific to the map if you develop the skill itself. And there are other times where I think if you can push that level of development into really strong areas, like let's say there's a theoretical player who has really good aim and then really good memorization, but not so much good other aspects of his gameplay, then he could actually theoretically make some very, very strong plays just because as he's going into a map and he's kind of memorizing it as he plays, his strong aim can carry him through the other aspects that maybe he has trouble with, especially if he does a very good job of not necessarily sight reading the map, but remembering the parts that he has trouble with and being able to focus on those plays specifically. So that's just an example of why I feel like it's a valuable skill that can be developed in. It doesn't necessarily always have to apply to one specific map, just because it is an overall skill. It's a fundamental aspect of your play that you can work on. So I just thought that was maybe an interesting point of discussion to maybe talk about a little bit, because I think it is a highly underrated aspect of gameplay, and it's not something that there's really any discussion on, period, is memorization. And let's say, I'm not saying necessarily what I'm saying is completely correct and it's completely true, it's all very hypothetical, but let's say that what I'm saying is true and you want to practice your memorization skills. I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about that too, because one of the biggest things that I noticed, and the reason that this was brought to my attention, was when I was learning a flashlight map, afterwards when I went into other maps to play those other maps, it felt exceptionally different in the sense that I was developing habits where I was picking up parts of the map that were more difficult for me to sight read, and I was getting them down like really, really, really fast, and it was almost like immediate improvement on the problems that I did have, that felt very much so because I was memorizing those specific parts of the map, and it was a skill that it was like a habit that almost sort of carried over from Flashlight, because Flashlight was just purely memorizing every little part of the map, obviously because, well, for obvious reasons. I mean, you can't even see the whole map, so you have to memorize a lot of it. And I started to realize, after playing with Flashlight for like 4 or 5 hours and practicing these specific maps and then coming into like no mod plays, that my overall skill level almost seemed to have jumped up in a sense where it felt very, very easy to fix mistakes that I had made, just because I'd practiced that sort of aspect of realizing where the mistakes come from. Because with Flashlight, it's a lot about you have to like play through it like several times and figure out where you have to move specifically, because you can't really sight read. And with that, there comes a lot of memorizing what your mistakes that you're making as you're doing the play. And that kind of idea sort of carried over into my play, and I felt very, very strong in terms of improving after doing that. I thought it was really interesting. That's an interesting point too that I hadn't necessarily considered. Porn account 42069 says, I think that memorization can definitely be helpful both on that specific map and otherwise, mostly because you can get both more easily memorize parts of other maps, but also it can give you muscle memory to patterns that you normally wouldn't have. And that is kind of true to an extent too, is if you are doing specific amounts of memorization, to a certain degree, you can memorize patterns as well, which might help you with more technical maps, or even not even super technical maps, just fundamental stuff that maybe you're not very strong on. I like that point. That's a nice point. It's also nice to memorize sometimes just so you can get a play on a favorite map or something like that. Yeah, I agree. And one of the interesting ideas that I was playing around with is, like, let's say you're me and you're at my level, and my highest play right now is a 336 performance point play, and I feel like I could start feeling pretty comfortable in pushing into 350 around that range performance point plays here pretty soon. Let's say though you dedicate yourself for like a day or two to memorizing a specific really difficult map that's way beyond your skill level, but it's something that you can do if you memorize individualistic parts of it and then kind of string it together. And let's say you make like a 370 performance point play, and it's like 2 days of work, but your biggest performance point play is the most impactful one in your ranking. And so I feel like it might be like a valuable skill in that sense, where maybe you can sort of cheat your body's limits into being able to do something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to with good memorization. That was kind of an idea I was playing around with. It's not something that I've experimented with, but you know, maybe it's something like that, where like, let's say theoretically I get to the point where I can do 350 plays, and I do a couple 350 plays, and then I memorize like a 370 play, and I manage to hit that 370 play, even though I wouldn't normally have the skill level to do the 370 play. The memorization kind of covers those areas that I was lacking in fundamentally. I don't know. I think it's a really interesting idea that people don't consider well enough, and it's kind of something that's almost underrated in a sense. Yeah.